When we poll farmers, many of them are applying 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. They cite concerns with lodging, maturity, and low test weights as reasons for keeping the nitrogen rates down. Those are all valid concerns, and ultimately the producer will judge those risks based on his own field experience. But more recent research by Bill May with Agriculture Canada out of Indian Head and ourselves here at Yorkton would suggest that 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre might be better unless growing conditions are poor or the field has high residual levels of soil nitrogen. Our current suggestion assumes soil nitrogen is close to around 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre or less. Let me show you some of our past experience before I get into the current study that I was asked to discuss.
This is Camden Oats from Yorkton in 2019. In response to added nitrogen, the blue line represents increasing yield and the orange line represents decreasing test weights. If test weights fall below the green arrow, which is marking 245 grams per half a liter, then oats would receive a discount. If the test weight falls below 230 grams per half a liter, marked by the purple arrow, then oats would be rejected. You can see test weights are being pushed into the rejection range with high rates of nitrogen. We consistently see Camden getting into trouble with test weights before a variety like Summit does based on our past work. However, half the oats accepted by grain millers are Camden, and they rarely have to reject Camden based on a low test weight. So why the disconnect? Well, it's been suggested to me that producers have higher test weights because they will blow more light seed out the back of their combines than we typically do in our plot work. This may be true, but Camden consistently has a lower test weight compared to a variety like Summit. Unfortunately, Summit is less resistant to lodging than Camden, which is also a very important factor to consider when choosing an oat variety. When basing economic returns on $6 per bushel for oat and $1.33 per pound for nitrogen, the most economic rate of nitrogen was at 90 pounds per acre. Here's Summit. Note the test weights are higher compared to Camden. They don't even get close to the rejection level regardless of nitrogen rate. Assuming no discount for test weights, the most economic rate of N was 94 pounds per acre in this case. Let's say you want to fertilize at 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre, but someone has asked you to reduce your nitrogen applications by 30%. Well, that would drop your rate down to 63 pounds per acre and would reduce your net revenue by $15 per acre. But maybe you are more risk adverse for fear of lodging and or poor growing conditions. In this case, you may typically put down 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Now, if someone asks you to reduce your rate by 30% to 42 pounds of N per acre, this will cost you $24 per acre in net return. Now, these economic consequences are for a responsive site with only 35 pounds of nitrogen in the soil. And all our sites certainly aren't like this every year. Here's Summit on 60 pounds per acre of background nitrogen during a drought. The most economic rate of N was 24 pounds of N per acre. Note how high the test weights are during the drought. They're sailing above the discount level. So I thought maybe drought is good for test weight. Well, here's Summit the following year on 92 pounds per acre of soil N during another drought, and test weights are in the discount range. While test weights typically decrease as yield is increased with added N, I have no idea how environmental conditions affect test weight. So this is my past experience that led us to develop the next study for discussion. Are oats responding to higher rates of applied macronutrients? Not just N, but P, K, and S. The study was conducted at 4 AgriArm locations on the east side of the province in 2021 and 22. The objectives of this study were to compare the yield response of oat to a historical recommendation of 60N versus a more recent recommendation of 90N. We also wanted to determine the relative importance of combining phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur with these different N recommendations in eastern Saskatchewan. The trial was designed as a factorial with 2 factors. The first factor was the level of PK and S, and the second factor was rate of nitrogen. There are 4 levels of PKS. We start with a full rate of PKS, which starts with 40 pounds of P2O5 per acre, 15 pounds of K2O per acre, and 10 pounds of sulfur per acre. Each macronutrient is then removed independently to determine the response to sulfur, potassium, and phosphorus. Each level of PKS was evaluated at 3 rates of nitrogen, which were 17, 60, and 90 pounds per acre. A no fertilizer check was also added to the treatment list, but it's only there for reference as it cannot be included in the factorial analysis. The variety used in this study was Arborg. I'm going to show you 8 figures like this one for each site year. The blue bars are oat yield in bushels per acre and the yellow bars are oat test weight in grams per half a liter. On the left is a green and red arrow indicating the discount and rejection level for oat test weight. The group of bars on the left are showing you the main effects for the level of PKNS, and the group on the right are the main effects for the rate of nitrogen. In the bottom left-hand corner are soil test results for each site for your reference. At Indian Head in 21, yields were decent and significantly increased with added nitrogen up to 90 pounds per acre, since the soil nitrogen was very low. In contrast, test weight was reduced by increasing N, but was still well above the rejection level. Compared to the full PKS check, none of the limited treatments were significantly different. In other words, there was no significant responses to P, K, or S. However, the P-limited treatment was lowest yielding. The soil test indicated soil levels for P were medium. A lack of a response to S and K was not surprising because the soil test levels for K were high and cereals tend to be much less responsive to sulfur than canola. Test weights were unaffected by the level of P, K, and S. At Melfort in 21, yield significantly increased in response to added nitrogen up to 60 pounds per acre. Test weight decreased in response to increasing N, but still managed to stay well above the discount level. A statistically significant and strong yield decline occurred when phosphorus was removed. The response to P is not surprising since the soil tested low for phosphorus. Limiting sulfur did not affect yield, and limiting K resulted in a significant increase. It's unclear why that occurred. While there were definitely large numeric differences in test weight between the levels of P, K, and S, none were statistically significant. At Rivers in 21, yields were relatively low but significantly increased up to 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Test weights were low and were drastically reduced by increasing nitrogen into the rejection levels. While not statistically significant, there was a relatively large decline in yield when phosphorus was removed, not surprising as soil P was very low. No yield loss occurred when either S or K were removed. In fact, yields increased numerically. At Yorkton in 21, yields were very low due to drought and background soil nitrogen was extremely high. As a result, there was no yield response to added N. Test weights were very low, well into the rejection range, regardless of nitrogen rate. While not statistically significant, removing P fertilizer resulted in a yield reduction, as soil P was low. Removing either sulfur or potassium resulted in a significant yield loss. This was a bit of a surprise since the soil test indicated high levels for these macronutrients, and the yield potential of the oats was low because of the drought. At Indian Head in 22, oat yields were very responsive to added nitrogen, as the site had very low levels of soil N. Increasing N pushed test weights into the discount range. Yield was not responsive to any of the other micronutrients, not even phosphorus, which was at low levels based on soil testing. At Melfort in 22, oat yield significantly responded to added nitrogen, despite very high reserves of soil N. This was likely due to the very high yield potential, almost 200 bushels per acre at this site. Test weights were reduced by increasing N, but remained well above discount levels regardless of N rate. There were no significant yield responses to added P, K, or S. However, yield was reduced numerically when P was removed. At Redvers in 22, yield significantly increased in response to 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and test weight was reduced to just above the discount range. No yield responses to P, K, or S were observed. Lodging was starting to become a bit of an issue by 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Despite heavy hail received on June 23rd at Yorkton in 22, the crop recovered and yielded pretty respectable, averaging 140 bushels per acre. However, there wasn't a yield response to added nitrogen, as soil N reserves were very high, and hail would have reduced yield potential still by about 20 to 30%. Increasing nitrogen pushed test weights into the discount range, but they're still well above the rejection level. No significant yield responses to P, K, and S were detected. However, the K-limited treatment was numerically lower yielding. So let's put some economics to all this. This table shows the economic value per acre of increasing nitrogen above 17 pounds per acre. Calculations are based on $6 per bushel of oat and an N price of $1.33 per pound, taken from the Saskatchewan 2022 Crop Planning Guide. These values assume oats were never discounted for a low test weight. However, values in red had test weights in the rejection range, and values in green are in the discount range. These values may not have been rejected or discounted in reality, as producers may blow more light seed out the back of the combine than we do in plot work. Now, we were trying to demonstrate that an N recommendation of 90 pounds per acre was more economical than the old recommendation of 60 pounds of N per acre. Both of these recommendations were assuming there were about 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the soil. But the background N in the soil varied far more than this in this study. In 2021, soil reserves of nitrogen were high to very high at Melfort, Redvers, and Yorkton, and yield potentials were low at Redvers and particularly low at Yorkton due to drought. Economically, no more than 17 pounds of nitrogen per acre were needed at these locations. At Indian Head, 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre was the most economical, as background N was very low. In 2022, yield potentials were much higher. 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre was the most economic rate at Indian Head, which again had very low background reserves of nitrogen. However, 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre was also the most economic rate at Melfort, despite an extremely high reserve of soil nitrogen. This occurred because Melfort had a particularly high yield potential. At Redvers, the most economic rate was 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and only 17 pounds of nitrogen per acre was required at Yorkton. Again, Yorkton had a very high reserve of soil N, and its yield potential was reduced by hail. Numerically, there were a few sites that had positive returns from applying either P, K, or S. The low number of sites adequately responding to K was not particularly surprising to me because all soils tested high for this nutrient. A lack of responses to S also wasn't particularly surprising as cereals are much less responsive to S than canola. I was expecting more positive returns from the addition of phosphorus based on the soil tests. However, even at medium levels of soil P, there's only a 50% chance of observing a response to added P. Although sites were relatively unresponsive to added P, it is still important to maintain or increase residual levels of soil P in order to maximize yield potential. Past study has found yield on soils testing low for phosphorus cannot be maximized by applying high rates of seed place P in season. To maximize yield, soil reserves of P must be maintained near 15 parts per million, as plants obtain a substantial proportion of their P requirement from the entire soil volume they occupy. In other words, crops respond to both P fertilizer and background P fertility. Conclusions. If background soil nitrogen is 30 pounds per acre or less, and growing conditions are good, 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre can be the most economic rate. However, considerably less nitrogen was required at sites that were dry and/or had high reserves of soil nitrogen. This illustrates the importance of soil testing when determining rates. Lodging was never an issue in our study, but our trials are not typically grown in field depressions. Lodging will be a greater risk on a variable landscape, and producers will assess their lodging risk based on field knowledge. Variable rate N could help manage this issue. Some yield responses to added P, K, and S were detected in this study, but they weren't usually large. Added P would be the most important of the three for oats, and soil P levels should be maintained near 15 parts per million to maximize yield potential. Test weight was consistently reduced with added nitrogen, but effects of P, K, and S were not frequent or consistent. In addition to ADOPT funding and Sask Oats, I'd also like to thank grain millers who often do some seed testing for us for free.